Alrighty, let's get started. And we are recording. Cool. Hello, everyone. My name is Amrit, and welcome back to this Learning Python from Scratch webinar. Last lesson or last webinar was on Friday, and we took a look at how to do for loops in Python. For loops is just one of the two types of loops we will be looking at. And loops are really useful in order to repeat a piece section of code again and again. Today, however, we won't be covering the second type of loops. We will be diving deeper into for loops and just showing how they could be more useful. I'm just going to make sure that my settings seem okay. My mic should be working, so there should be no audio errors. And I do have chat open, so if you do come in and watch live, you can ask me questions and I will be able to answer them. So let me start sharing my screen. Where is the second one? There it is. Cool. Let's minimize that. And there we go. Cool. So last session, last webinar, I gave everyone this as a challenge. So the entire challenge revolved around using for loops, and this was very full. Obviously, you had to use for loops, and it was fairly straightforward in that regard. So let me show you my code for it. And the challenges will encourage you to use methods. They may seem a bit random and just not necessary. And you can do a code without any methods, which is perfectly fine. But in order to get the practice in of using methods, the code did ask to have a method that should get the swimmer's number and as an argument and return whatever their disability rating is or category. And another method that should calculate the legality of the team, returning a Boolean answer. Boolean, of course, being true or false. So if you are confused at any point of anything that I say, just take a look at past webinars. They are up on YouTube on our SB Components YouTube channel. So on the second webinar, I believe, we did go over data types, and Boolean is just true or false, which we'll get into the code in a sec, but I have those two methods there just to show how to do it exactly how it's written here and just for the practice of using methods. This can be done without using methods, which is perfectly fine, but it's good. It's always good practice to start using methods. So let's kind of go over how this works. We want the shell on the side. So it's a fairly straightforward. Let's also get the image back up. There it is. So we could refer to what the program is supposed to do at what point. So right off the bat, the way basic outline of how the program works is you give it the maximum number of points allowed for the race, the swimming race. And then it's always going to be full races, so you don't have to worry too much about that. So you give it the max number of points, and then the program asks you for swimmer 1, swimmer 2, swimmer 3, swimmer 4, and you give it whatever points each swimmer is. So let's say swimmer 1 has the point category 10 for disability or whatever. Give it all the points. The program adds them all up and tells you whether your team is legal or not. If it goes over the limit, the program should say that this team is not legal for whatever reason and display a message. So in either case, it needs to display the total and whether it's legal or not. There was a hint here to use a variable that keeps a running total. I'll explain in a sec because I have used that. But let's get into how I've done it. Now, of course, I have used two methods. Obviously, you can name methods whatever you want. I named one method get disability, so it should kind of make sense that what this method is supposed to do. So this method is just supposed to get the disability rating or category of a swimmer. So obviously, these are the arguments. This is what this method needs in order to run. As you can see, I've used this swimmer down here. I convert it to a string so I could just format it a little easier. Yeah, so in order for this method to run, it needs to have a sort of, so you need to give it swimmer. Um, so it needs one variable or one argument in order to run. On the other hand, this variable, this method that I called legality, which basically just checks if the team is legal. So also note I have used comments. Best way to use comments is one per method, just describing what the method does. And if the method is really complex, just a quick explanation of how it does it. So you don't need comments for every single line, just a block of code. And then I just said this is the main part of the code that actually runs. So this should be fairly easy to follow through. Comments, one per method, is usually just fine. So yeah, legality takes two arguments. So in order for this method to work or Python to accept you to use this method, you need to give it two items in this order of the team and maximum. So I could have actually used a better variable name there. So instead of team, I could use team number or team points. And over here, maximum is just the maximum they're allowed to hit. So this part of the code is fairly straightforward. So maximum points just holds over here what the maximum number of points for this relay event is, which is fairly straightforward at this point. At this point, you should know how to get an input from the user and convert it to an integer. Also note that this will cause an error if the user types in anything other than the number. So if the user enters ASDF or 20 in words and not numbers, this will break Python and Python will complain. For now, we always assume that the user enters figures or numbers or whatever that allows the program to work normally. Later on, we will be looking at how to make sure that what the user has entered is correct. So yeah. So max points just holds over here the maximum number of points for the event, and this is what, in my example at least, is a running variable or running total, a variable that keeps the running total. And all the running total is throughout the code or throughout your code, it will update the variable each time some event occurs. So each time the user enters the points for a swimmer, it will just add it on to this variable. So you always want to set, generally speaking, you want to set running totals to 0. It depends on its use, of course. So depending on what you want to use a running total for, you use it accordingly. But in our example, we just want to total all the points of the swimmer. So of course, we start from 0. And here's our for loop. Pretty straightforward. So for I in range 4. So of course, if you don't understand what this is doing, do look at Friday's webinar of how to use for loops. So all this code is going to do is run this code 4 times. Remember though, from Friday's webinar, that it's going to run, so when it does run 4 times, it's going to run I as 0 first, then 1, then 2, then 3. So when you do use range, it goes from 0 to 1 less than whatever you give it. That is exactly 4 numbers, but just to reiterate the point that as computer scientists, we always start counting from 0. And of course, I is a variable that for the for loop, Python just creates for you to use. So for I in range 4, to do this 4 times, each time I being a different value, either 0, 1, 2, or 3, and just run this chunk of code. Well, I say chunk of code, it's just one line. So all I do is team points plus equals get disability I plus 1. So let's kind of break this down. So team points is, of course, our running total, which should make sense. So we want to add whatever the user enters for get disability. Of course, over here, I have done it all in one line. I could have done it in 2 separate lines. So one line being a variable equals int input, or you could just do it in one line to return whatever the user enters as an integer. So hopefully that makes sense. If you do have any questions, do leave them in chat. Yeah, so plus equals, if you don't remember what that does, is it just adds whatever this is to this value. So if this was 1 and this was 1, this would just make it 2. So just add whatever this is equal to itself. So just add whatever this number is to itself. So plus equals is really useful. It kind of makes two lines into one. It makes it fairly straightforward to use. So team points plus equals, so add whatever get disability returns. But as an argument, no, I've done I plus 1 because we want some 1, 2, 3, and 4. But no, when we run this for loop, it's going to run as 0, 1, 2, 3. So if we just add 1 to I, whenever we give it through as an argument, instead of doing 0, 1, 2, 3, we would do 1, 2, 3, 4. So of course 0 turns to 1, 1 turns to 2, 2 turns to 3, 3 turns to 4. And this is just a very common thing you're going to end up doing just within the for loop, just because you don't, if you ever want to display information to the user, generally speaking, you want it to be 1, 2, 3, 4, not 0, 1, 2, 3. And yeah, you'll find yourself doing this a lot, especially if you want to display some sort of information to the user. So this is fairly straightforward. So get disability is of course this method, and we give it whatever swimmer we're on, which is just which part of the loop we're on, so which iteration we're doing. So that is fairly straightforward. So at this point we have, so after this for loop is complete, of course it runs 4 times. So when it's complete, we will have the total points of all 4 swimmers. Do note we don't store the individual points. We just store a total of all of them as we're going along. So 10 plus 8 is 18. So after the second loop has been done, the running total is 18. Then we add another 8, which is 26. Then another 8, which is 34. So yeah, we don't store them individually. We store them as a total. And whoops, now this last four lines is really straightforward. All this does is check if legality is true, giving it the team points and max points. Of course, team points being the running total and max points being how much they are allowed, and printing accordingly. Of course, you need to understand if statements, and I forget which lesson if statements was. I don't, let me quickly check which webinar if statements were. They were webinar 3, I believe. So if you don't understand what if and then this else does, go check out our 3rd webinar on YouTube. It should be there. So this may confuse a lot of people right off the bat, so let me explain. The entire idea of this was, since legality, or whatever you decided to name your method, returns a Boolean value, either true or false, depending if team is less than or equal to the maximum. Also note that the variable names here are different. That is 100% allowed. A lot of people new to programming will always try to keep the same names, which is perfectly fine, but do note that it being different names is perfectly fine. Now, that being said, where was I? Yeah, so since legality does return a Boolean value, within an if statement, if the entire point of an if statement is it determines whether the statement you give it is true or false, and if it's true, it runs it. If it's false, it doesn't do anything. Which is why in an if statement, if you had let's say x equals y, like so, it wouldn't work, because this isn't comparison. As I said in an earlier webinar, 1 equal sign is assignment, and to Python will just give you an error. Like this doesn't determine true or false. This is just assignment. Hence, if you do 2 equal signs, this is comparing is x equal to y, and Python will give you true or false. So since legality returns either a true value or a false value, so if it returns true, it then prints that the team is legal and gives whatever the team points was. Otherwise, if it isn't legal, it has to be not legal, and it prints out its points accordingly. So let's take a look at this code running. So let's run it. Okay. There we go. So let's pull up the image one more time, just so we could use one of the examples. So let's kind of do both examples, and we'll look at how it runs. So the max number of points for this event is 34, and then it's just 10 with 3 8s followed by. So 1, 2, 3, and bang, the team is legal. Of course, note that it does print swimmer 1, swimmer 2, swimmer 3, swimmer 4 because of the I+1 we did, and it's pretty much the exact same as this. Let's move this to this side quickly. It doesn't matter which side we do it. Run on module, and then let's bring the image back up. There we go. Cool. Let's do the second example. So this example basically shows it's not legal. So 32, 9, 9, 8, 7. Bang. It adds it up correctly. It goes to 33, which is not legal. And everything else seems fine. So let's get rid of this. And this is just a basic overview of for loops. Now we are going to be using for loops again today. And we're going to be kind of going through the second main use, which is using it in alongside arrays. So let's get rid of this and let's start coding. So arrays are a really useful thing in programming, but however, Python doesn't really have arrays. It has lists. Now the difference between arrays and lists are pretty small. But that being said, it's just a useful thing to know. So Python doesn't technically have arrays. It has lists, but they work in pretty much the exact same way. I'll explain the differences when we get to them. But for now, just keep that on your head. Keep that on your mind. So the entire point of using arrays is to make life easier, pretty much. So imagine you had to take let's say you're a doctor and you needed to take information off 100 patients. Instead of doing this, so patient 1 is equal to whatever, patient 2 is equal to whatever, doesn't matter. So this is the main problem that arrays fix. So instead of doing patient 1, patient 2, patient 3, patient 4, patient 5, all the way down to patient 100, arrays simplify it to one line. And instead of, let's just call it patient. Actually, let's say we're in a school and we're using students, so students. Arrays work in the same way as variables. So you do students, and it's equal to these square brackets. Now you could, this basically creates an empty array, and is a storage container which stores multiple values. Now, in other programming languages, they have to be of the same type. So if you create an array, it can only store one type of information, whether that be strings, integers, floats, Boolean, whatever. But in Python, arrays can store whatever at whatever position. So it could be a string, int, Boolean, float, character, whatever. So Python does make it easy in that regard, and we will take a look at how to use it now. So that's how you create an array. Whoops, that's how you create an array, and yeah. So let's actually create an array with numbers in it. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So we just created an array with 10 values in it. So the first value in the array is 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, then 6, all the way to 10. And you separate elements within arrays with a comma. Yeah, so that's an array with 10 values in it, all being numbers from 1 to 10. Now, in order to access a given value, is really straightforward. So let's say we want to print out a given value. Actually, let's just print out the entire array first. So students. And let's see how this prints. So let's run it. Oh, I haven't saved it today. Lesson 7. Cool. And there we go. So when you print it out, it actually prints out the square brackets too, because it's an array, and it prints out all the values inside of it. Now that's how you print out the entire array. Now let's just print out one specific value. And in order to do that, use the square brackets again, no equal sign, just right next to the variable name or the array name, and you give it what position you want the value out of. So let's say we want position 2. What do you think, just take a second to think about it, what value do you think this will print? So I said position 2. Now consider something I said earlier on today about for loops. The same applies have. So just consider what value you think this will print. So let's run it. And as soon as I press OK, just take a second. Cool. So let's run it. And there we go, it printed 3. Even though we're printing position 2, it printed the third number, which is, technically speaking, position 3. Now, why did it do that? Reason being is like for loops, arrays also start counting from 0. So this, you would say, is the first position, is the first element, but to programming languages, this is the 0th position, or so position 0. So this is 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So this goes from 0 to 9. Now, if we do print 0, just to show you, run module, okay. There we go, it printed out 1 because 1 is in the first slot, which is the 0th position. Now, if we were to print 10, Python would freak out because there isn't anything in the 10th position. So Python would just give you an error and say list index is out of range. So this is a very common error to get, list index out of range. So just know if you do get this error, it basically means you're trying to access a position that doesn't exist in your array. So it's a really common error, so just take a look at how you're accessing your array, and you should be able to figure out what's going on at that point. So yeah, just do keep that in mind. And so we've looked at. And just to show you how to do it, I'm going to show you by Googling it. This I can't stress enough, if you're ever stuck in programming, well, Google search 99% of the time is all you need into learning how to do whatever it is you need to do. So right now we're just wanting to look at how to get information and out of arrays and how to play around with them. So for now, let's just type in arrays in Python. And W3 Schools is a pretty decent site to use. And just one click, let's see how fast the internet is today. It shouldn't normally take that long. Cool. I'm just going to put this to the side just so when it loads, I will put it back up. Ooh, we just couldn't load the site altogether. Let's see another site. I guess this is a fine site. W3 Schools is generally a good site, but for some reason it wasn't opening for me. But yeah, so Python arrays, exactly how we've. That's false. It isn't. Oh wait, no. That is not Python. This is actual arrays in Python. So in Python we do use lists. They are called lists. Yeah, there we go. So these are arrays in Python, but technically they are called lists. And I guess this is a good point for me to kind of explain what the difference is. So of course you could go through this and look at how you play around with them and what you could do. Arrays in Python, or lists as they're actually called, do have methods attached to them that really help you out. So if you want the length of a array, you could just use len, max, min. We'll go through them in a sec. And these are the ones I was trying to go hint at when I was saying how to add stuff to arrays and take stuff out. So like append something. So we're going to look at append now in a sec. We're going to look at pop and remove. And yeah, I don't think we're going to be using anything else. Even though Python does have a sort function, we are not going to be using it. Cool. So let's talk about the differences between arrays and lists first. So an array in most, well, pretty much all programming languages is pretty much the same as a list, but it has a fixed size. So let's say you create an array with 10 values, or size an array with that could hold 10 values. It can only hold 10 values and it can't hold anything more. That's by definition what an array is, just a storage location that can hold a fixed number of items or objects. But in Python, they kind of took that out and implemented it so you could hold, technically speaking, an infinite number of items in an array, which doesn't make an array at that point. It makes it a list. List, you could add stuff to it, remove stuff. But since they use square brackets, that's a notation for arrays, and that's how we're going to be teaching them as arrays. But yeah, so that's just for your knowledge. The difference between an array and a list is that lists could hold an infinite number of data, and arrays can only hold a fixed number. But now let's look at how to remove and add stuff to arrays. Now, adding stuff to an array is really straightforward. You give you type out the name of your array. So in this case, it's students. So students is equal to, actually no, we want to add. So you use a dot. Note that this dot, I actually didn't know Python does this. So Python has come up with what you may want to use. That being said, so do note, like from our records webinar, we used to use dot and then the variable name in order to access a variable in our record. It's the same for lists or arrays because they are objects and they have methods associated with them. We're going to be using the append method. That's actually pretty cool. The append method, and what the append method does, it just adds something to the end of the list, and being the keyword, but yes, it adds something to the end of the list. So let's say we want to add 11 to the end. So over here, let's print the array students, and I'm going to quickly copy paste this underneath so we could see how it differs. So if we run this, there we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, all the way to 10. And the second one had 11 added to it. Now, on the other hand, if we want to remove something, there's ways of removing it. The first way is obviously writing out your array name again, so students, dot. Now, the first one we're going to look at is pop. And pop doesn't take any arguments. Of course, this is an argument that we give the method. Pop doesn't take any arguments. All pop does is it removes the last thing in your array, so the thing right at the end. So if we print it again, there we go, print. Let's run it. Okay, there we go. So it just removed what's at the end. Why this is useful, we'll get on in a future webinar when we look at how to, when we start looking at data structures. I don't know how further down in the line that will be, and just how heaps and stacks and all that type of stuff. So pop is useful, but for now, the main one we would probably be interested in is remove. And you tell it what you want to remove, and I do believe it removes the first occurrence of that value. So for now, let's just say we want to remove, not 32, 3. Let's run it, run module, okay. And there we go, as you can see in this version, it removed 3 because this should be 3 and it's 4 instead. Just as a little test, let's add a 3 to the end. And let's see if it removes both versions of 3 or only one. So the 3 at the end stays, but it still removes 3, the first 3 in the array. So do note that remove only removes one instance of an object and the first instance of the object in your array, which is something useful to know. So if you want to remove all 3s in an array, you kind of need to probably use some sort of loop to do it. Now let's see what happens if we try to remove something that isn't in the array. Does Python give an error, or what happens? There we go, Python does give an error, remove x, x is not in the list. Pretty straightforward error. But yeah, it's just good to know that if you try to remove something that isn't in the list, it will give you an error. We still have time for more, so let's keep going. Another useful thing to know in Python, you won't be using it much yet, and this is Python specifically, because off the top of my head I can't think of how you would do it in Java, as for an example. But if you're going to be accessing a point in an array, you could specify from what point to another point. So let's say we want to get, I don't know, the first 5 values in an array. Well, it's pretty straightforward. You could say we want it from the 0th position, colon means 2, in this case, to the 5th position. And I do believe this should return 1 to 5. I could be wrong. There we go, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That being said, you didn't really need the 0. If you don't have a number on one side, it just means to the end. So if you run this, okay, it goes from the start to whatever position you said. If you want from, let's say, position 3 to position 8, I guess, and we run this, okay, there we go. So position 3 is, of course, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, which is position 8. That being said, I just remembered, do note that I do say position 5, but it's 1 less than 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So position 5 is technically 6, but this always does 1 less. But when you specify a starting point, it does start at that point. So 0, 1, 2. So this should be a 3. The first number here should be a 3. There we go. So 3. So 1 less than whatever you give it here. This is really useful. We will be using these later down the line, not just yet though. And it does have cool properties that we will be taking advantage of. There we go. Let's just remove this 3, just so we could keep it consistent. There we go. So 1 to 10. What else do you need to know? Okay, so so a really common way of using arrays. We will get into 2-dimensional arrays and 3-dimensional arrays later. Or actually, we'll talk about it at the end of today's session. But a really common way of using arrays is using 2 arrays with each other in order to store information about something. So let's kind of explore what that means. So instead of student, I'm going to do student name. And I'm going to do student score is equal to, for now, a blank array. Cool. Let's get rid of these numbers. So now we have 2 blank arrays called student name and student score. A really common way of using arrays is having, of course, you can use records, and I would probably advise to use records in something like this. But for now, imagine records don't exist. This is purely to practice arrays. And yeah, this is purely to practice arrays. And a really common way of using arrays is that a position in one array corresponds to a position in another array. So let's fill this array with like 3 or 4 names. So my name, let's go with SB, just because. And let's go with Bob. You can't forget Bob. And let's say they scored in a Python exam 100, 88, and 70 respectively. So a really common way of using arrays is that the 0th position in one array corresponds to the 0th position of another array. So the score of Amrit would be 100, score of SB would be 88, score of Bob would be 70. And in today's exercises, or in today's challenge that I'll give you at the end, this is kind of how I expect you to do it. So this is just a little hint for that challenge. Now, if we were to go through it, now let's bring for loops back into the mix and how we're going to use for loops with arrays. So the first way we're going to do it is the exact same way for I in range. I'm going to leave range blank for now, but this is how we're used to seeing for loops, and we're going to add something different within range. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to do len, which stands for length of student name. So what this basically means is, well, we are familiar of what this does for I in range. We're familiar with that, but we're only familiar having a number inside of here. But what this is doing is this len basically just returns how big this array is. So since it's 3 values, it's going to return 3, and this for loop is going to do it 3 times. Now, you should be able to see how useful this is. And let's take advantage of it. So for now, let's just print a message saying, let's just say student name. So this person got student score. I'll explain this in a sec. If I spelled it right, yeah. Student score I in their Python test. Cool. Let's run it and I'll explain exactly how it does what it does. Whoops, student score is not defined. So I have misspelled it. Student score. I mean, best thing to do is just copy this and replace it there. There we go. So I did just spell it differently. And of course, you need to spell it the exact same in order for it to work. Yeah, there we go. So Amrit got 100 in the Python test, SB got 88, Bob got 70. Now the way this does it is really straightforward. Note that we did say that Python starts counting from 0. Reason being is arrays also start counting from 0. So since we know this is length 3, because of course this returned 3, this is going to say, okay, I need to do this 3 times. So the first time it does it is 0, second time it does it is 1, third time it does it is 2, and of course 0, 1, 2 correspond to these exact positions. And we use them in both together to store information about them. So let's say in our relay race thing that we were doing earlier on, we could have stored these in an array and then just added them up later, but we didn't need it for the code. But that is something we could have done. So this is really useful right off the bat. So using I basically just says whenever you're going through, so as I changes from 0, 1 to 2, this also accesses that corresponding positions, and since position 0 here refers to 0 here, 1 refers to 1, 2 refers to 2, this is very useful. Now, let's get into another way how for loops could interact with arrays and how I tend to use them a lot. Actually, I don't see a lot of other people using it. But it's good to know that this is an option. So just to show you student name, print I. So I'll explain this in a sec. Let's run this. There we go. So what for I in a variable name? So of course I could type in student score and it'll do the exact same thing. All it does is I just becomes, each time you run the for loop, I just becomes the next value in the array. So the first time you run the for loop, I becomes the 0th thing. The next time you run it becomes the next thing. Next time you run it becomes the next thing. Now, I do remember in Friday's webinar on for loops, I did explain, I did say that we'll cover in detail what range actually does in Python and why it kind of works. Now, it works for the exact same reason as this, because when you do range, let's say, when you do range 4, what this actually ends up doing, I should do this as a comment. Whoops. Let's put this at our comment here. So what range 4 actually does is it creates an array with values 0, 1, 2, 3. And range 4 actually returns this array. If you were to do range 4, it will return this array. And at that point, is the exact same as this because we're just going through array one by one. And each time we run the for loop, it just goes to the next value. This is very useful to do in certain scenarios, just go through an array doing something to every single value or whatever. But the downside to this is you have zero idea what position you're at, and if you want to access an array at the exact same position, like a different array at the exact same position, you can't do that. You're going to have to do it using the first method. But in certain scenarios, this is very useful. And if we ever do come across a scenario where we need to do this, I will explain this. You can do this in other programming languages too. But yeah, this is just an option that I'm putting out there for you to be able to use in the future. But yes, that is the majority of things to do with arrays. I can sit down here and go through everything arrays could do, but we'll be here forever. So if you are at a point and you're stuck and you don't know how to, you want to do something with an array and don't know how to, just Google it up. In programming, it's pretty much a skill to be able to Google something up when you're confused and solve your problem that way. And plus, you're more likely to remember if you Google something up and go through the process of finding it that way rather than someone else telling you, because you're less likely to remember that. Of course, you're only going to remember how to play around with arrays if you do practice. So I do have two fairly similar challenges. It's literally the exact same challenge, just the print statements are slightly different. So do give this a go. Another difference is at the end you just print this out in the opposite order. So this one is about movies. You give it a movie, you tell it how many millions of pounds it raised. So you could go and you could go through, I think it specifies five films. So your for loop initially has to run through 5 times, collecting 5 separate movies in this format. Don't use records for this. So movie 1 refers to movie 1 here, movie 2 refers to movie 2, movie 3 to movie 3. Let's bring this back up. So in this format, don't use records, use this just for practice of accessing, adding stuff to arrays, taking stuff out. And once you've done that, you need to print out information about the movie, so what the user entered and how many pounds it raised. Over here, you ask them for it in millions of pounds, and over here you display it in the actual pounds. Reason for this is just so you can practice manipulating values in Python. And at the end, you want to say the total amount of money all of them combined made. It's up to you how you want to do this. I'm not sure if I said you need to use methods. I don't think I have. Nope. I don't think I said to use methods. But I do highly recommend you use methods. Try to use them wherever you can, but use them logically. And definitely use comments to break down your code, so if someone else reads it, they know what's going on. This is fairly similar. This is about music. But it's instead of how much money made, just how many thousands of times it was downloaded, and it's pretty much the same thing, just flipped slightly. And this was about five movies. This is about 4 tracks. I will be showing you code for both of these in tomorrow's webinar. Tomorrow's webinar, if I remember correctly, will be on the second type of loops called while loops. This is recording. Yes, this is recording. So this will be on YouTube within 2 or so hours. That being said, thank you so much for watching. If you're on YouTube, do come to the live sessions if you do have any question. If you're on the live session, feel free to just ask questions whenever you may want to. So this is today's challenge. The reason I didn't go through one and then keep one as a challenge is because they're pretty much the exact same code, just worded slightly differently. So for you, it wouldn't really be a challenge where you could just copy what I've done and just change a couple words and do it that way. So this is, you could do either one, you could do both for practice. I would recommend the more practice the better, so do both for practice, but you only really need to do one for just understanding how arrays work. I can't think of anything else, and that's pretty much all the time we do have for today. So thank you so much for listening. I hope you've learned something useful, and I will see you in the next webinar. So do take a screenshot of this, pause the video, feel free, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.